I think the poet obviously chose to write about something that was really close to her heart, and absolutely the centre of the poem is her frustration with the fact that such a basic commodity as basic as water is not there in these people's lives in this poor suburb of India. And again, it's something that's absolutely relevant again to our society, because it's something we need to be aware of, and we need to also make sure that we're not taking that commodity for granted, and raise awareness that in the 21st century there's still parts of the world living without water. Yeah,
so in that sense it does compare to sort of nothing's changed in that way, and that, you know, that's a poem about injustice between different ethnic backgrounds, and in Two Scavengers that's a poem about the injustice between rich and poor, so just like in Blessing, the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, definitely. And what's also really interesting is the fact that she's decided to focus on the reactions to the water as well. It's really sweet to see the reaction of the children, whose highlights are polished to perfection, almost presented as cherubs really. And you can really vividly picture the scene compared to the absolute frantic desperation of the adults, which is really upsetting, the fact that they know that they need to be practical about this, and they're literally frantically grabbing for everything that they can to collect this blessing of water.
Sort of shown through that punctuation, every man, woman, child, the streets around, but in the, you know, the enjambment there, and the way that there was no punctuation, just the excitement, yes, of the children, but also the desperation.
Yeah.
Then you've got that contrast, obviously, between the beginning, that simile, the skin cracking like a pot, and that very bold statement, there never is enough water, to all that description that she draws in later on.
Yeah, that was similar to Island Man, really, parts where again you've got this sort of the two words groggily and Island Man that absolutely reflect him, this confused, dazed sense of coming around, which is completely separate to the rest of the poem. So it's quite an interesting sort of structural comparison that you could make.
I mean, I think what I really find interesting about the poem is some of the really strong imagery. So that first scene, the skin cracks like a pod, you know, you can almost feel like, you know, when you've got dry skin and, you know, feeling really dehydrated. But also some of this vocabulary, all this kind of religious vocabulary, things like fortune and kindly God and congregation, you know, all linking back to the title, blessing. You know, this is something almost spiritually significant to them, and yet it's only water.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so effective, because it is this extended metaphor that runs throughout. And as you said, all the references, the religious references that are made to water, that again, us in sort of our part of the world, we can try and sympathise with, but we find it difficult to empathise with. But we can absolutely get the impression that this is the most important thing that's happening, and that has maybe happened to this village for some time, as it says, sometimes the sudden rush. So yeah, and that really comes through, you said, with the extended metaphor, the huge importance that it has in these people's lives.
And then you get the sort of the onomatopoeias of crash and kind of flow to kind of bring to mind, you know, this event in the water flowing out the pipe. But also, from when you look at the poem, you begin with a very short stanza, and then the stanzas go increasingly longer, almost like you imagine, you know, the initial drip of the water and then the cascade. But then the final stanza, shorter again, suggesting maybe that the water's running out and that this momentary blessing really won't last that long.
Yeah, definitely. And the end of the poem as well, so in terms of, it is a shorter stanza, and it also really leaves me feeling a little bit upset really by the end, as I think maybe the poet wants us to feel, because you're reminded again about the malnourished children, the fact that when this water does run out, the children will just resort back to being without it, and the bones aren't developing, the bones will remain small. So there's that real sense of, again, desperation really, and frustration that the poet feels that this is the way it is, and those two words right at the end of the poem really emphasise and echo that that these children are small and that they're undernourished, they're malnourished.
And ending a little bit like Limbo, where you sort of, you know, you go through this horrendous journey, and then you've got the music saving him at the end, but then again you've got those two words, burning ground, which sort of, you know, the poem seems to have been quite joyful towards the end, but then there is ultimately that sort of darkness there, that threat. Yeah,
it's also interesting, it's from the language, the word choices, it's quite obviously placed in a completely different culture to one that we know, municipal pipe. Again, we know this is a poor community that are having to share a pipe. And it's interesting the reaction when we think of a pipe bursting in our sort of part of the world. We imagine that the people are late for work, people are going to miss the commute, would become more stressful. There'd be anger about it, we'd want something to be done about it, it's a hazard, it's something that's in our way. Whereas this burst pipe is an absolute joyous celebration and something.
A godsend.
Yeah, a godsend, and that's really interesting. Something to really think about. I think the poet wants us to think about as well.
So, what do you think about the poem then? How do you feel about your personal response?
I like the poem in that it shows the absolute innocence of the children, and it reminds me again of how you can find joy in really simple event and the way that they respond to it. And like I said, it's really naive and innocent, the way that you can imagine them dancing around in the sun, and again, as we've said, there's like really vivid images created. And I also like the sense that despite them living sort of, as you assume, in a drought, in such a dry part of the world, there's this huge sense of community and togetherness, which again is, as we said earlier, is reflected in this every man, woman. They're all together.
And the
they're not
congregation.
separate. Yeah, and the congregation idea. They're a group of people that are responding to this, even though they're panicking and they're desperate, they're all coming together and they're grabbing pots and pans as if nobody actually owns the pots and pans, that they're theirs just to grab. There's this sense that...
Really communal.
Yeah, communal, definitely.
And I think, yes, I suppose it does make you reflect, doesn't it, on just how fortunate you are that, you know, you take these little things for granted and maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what the poet Dharker is really wanting us to think about as well, you know. This is, on the surface, a very joyful poem, but again, it's got its dark elements.
Yeah, definitely.